So welcome everyone to this morning's keynote address. I'm Kate Cook, as it says on my little box, and Secretary of the Australian Sociological Association. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land it is I come to you from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And there's a few housekeeping matters before we begin. When we come to the discussion section of the keynote, if you can write your question in the Q&A, you can either do that and I will read them out to Christy, or you can put up your hand and I'll try and keep a list of the order in which people have put their hands up. Christy would like to provide as much time as possible for questions, so there should be a good opportunity for discussion at the end of the session. So to introduce our esteemed keynote, Christy E Newman is the Associate Professor at the Centre for Social Research in Health and Associate Dean Engagement and Impact in Arts, Design and Architecture at UNSW Sydney. Christy is the leading social researcher for health, sexuality and gender, with a particular focus on HIV prevention and care, sexual and reproductive health, and LGBTQ+ health and wellbeing. They have authored more than 100 peer-reviewed publications, received more than 20 grants, totaling almost 6 million, and regularly contributes research-informed perspectives to media, professional and community discussions of diverse families, relationships and identities. Christy is the past editor-in-chief of Health Sociology Review and led a recent special issue exploring social perspectives on trans health. And I have it on good authority from a mutual colleague that Christy is described as an academic dreamboat. So this is going to be good, and Christy can try and figure out which colleague that is. Christy's keynote is on sociology at the intersections, in which they will examine classifications and the intersection of sociology and public health, and how this intersection has emerged in Christy's own and applied research. So before I hand over to Christy, I'll ask everyone to mute their microphones and then we will begin. Thank you very much. Over to you, Christy, the academic dreamboat.
How on earth do what do I do now with that? Thank you very much, Kay. Good morning, everybody. And thank you to Peter and everyone involved at TASA, who's been involved in preparing all the events for this week and for this opportunity to speak with you today. After nearly 5 months of lockdown and homeschooling in this house where I am now, I'm very happy to be sitting in a room by myself again, but also really looking forward to meeting with some of you in person again at some point, hopefully 2022. Before we start, I just want to explain I've included a lot of QR codes in my slides, which you can use to look up the publications that I refer to, given we all know how to use QR codes now, thanks to COVID. But I'm also going to paste the references that I mentioned in the chat at the end. So don't stress if you miss things or if you're keen to find a different way to access them. Also, the images that are on the slides that I've used are all photos that I've taken on my phone over the last few years. This is one of the main ways that I find moments of joy in my everyday life, and I hope you'll indulge me in using and looking at these instead of plain PowerPoint backgrounds. So I want to start by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event today. I'm joining from unceded Gadigal land in the inner west of Warang, also called Sydney. I pay my respects to the Gadigal elders who've maintained custodianship of this land, this country, through centuries of violence and dispossession, sustaining a continuous connection between people and place through the protection of local laws, knowledge and culture. And I also acknowledge the owners of the land on which I was born and raised, on Wajak Noongar Boodja, particularly in the area of Wallyallup, or what I grew up knowing as Fremantle. And I'm working across two monitors here, so let's hope that this is going to work. Yes, my slide's working, hopefully. You can see some of the gorgeous wildflowers here from that country where I was raised, the red and green coolabrung or kangaroo paw glowing here in the afternoon light in this photo that I took way back in the days when I could travel home to see my family in Western Australia. I also want to acknowledge the people who raised me there, the descendants of several generations of settlers, mainly from Ireland, who contributed to the harms caused in this country by colonisation, even as they were escaping a colonised country themselves. I took the photo on the right just before COVID hit, on the farm where my great-grandfather was born, on the border of Cork, Limerick and Tipperary, and where the people I'm descended from form part of local community resistance to British oppression. I see the continuing impacts of this history of colonisation and forced migration in my family today, and it influences my personal commitment to supporting the call in the Uluru Statement from the Heart for a First Nations voice to Parliament and a Makarrata Commission to oversee a process of agreement making with governments and truth-telling about the historic and continuing impacts of colonisation in this country. And one of those processes of truth-telling has to include recognising the devastating impact of what Professor Sandy O'Sullivan has called the colonial project of gender and everything else. Please do read the full article. There's your first QR code. But I want to start my talk today by speaking to this quote, which I've pulled out of the conclusion, where they discuss the significance of Indigenous people writing their own stories in the spirit of Indigenous sovereignty as a strategy for refusing the categories that colonisation imported and enforced in order to erase Indigenous ways of understanding and expressing gender. Quoting Anita Heiss, Professor O'Sullivan ends with a Wiradjuri expression, Yindya Mara, interpreted to mean respect, honour, be polite, which they describe as a practice for supporting the respectful inclusion of the figures of Indigenous people in stories written by non-Indigenous writers. This is a very generous concept and one that resonates profoundly with my own values in research. So I'm starting with this concept to acknowledge the importance of these ideas for what I'd like to discuss today, which is how we can all do more in sociology and beyond to promote genuinely inclusive approaches to research by working at the intersections of our own fields of practice, our areas of expertise, and our own personal and professional comfort zones. I know the term inclusion can be controversial because it can sound like a bit of a weasel word for calming down the radicals, permitting only tokenistic nods to different perspectives. But I see a truly inclusive approach to research as radical in itself because it demands that we reshape pretty much every aspect of what we do. So I hope that this can be an opportunity for each of us to stop for just a moment to reflect on where we might be hesitating from entering the points at which different truths might meet our own. These can be deeply uncomfortable and unsettling spaces to occupy, and it is counterintuitive to open ourselves up to these kinds of experiences when we're all juggling multiple demands for our time and attention and in times of crisis. But I feel very strongly that this is what sociology must do, to continuously seek out opportunities to be invited into respectful and honest dialogue and collaboration with those whose experiences and perspectives challenge our own. So, turning first to the opportunities we have to work at the intersection of different fields of practice. I currently work in what might be called applied sociology to some, but which I call working in partnership with the communities and institutions affected by, which are affected by and shape what we do as sociologists. But no matter the different ways we do sociology or other forms of social research and inquiry, there are boundaries and categories that we come up against that delimit the area in which we are permitted to play. And while some of those provide containers that are useful to locate ourselves in, we are all of us keenly aware of the tensions between our own experiences and the systems of language and meaning that seek to describe these experiences. In writing these words, I realised I've been interested in both the reductive and the productive effects of social categories for a couple of decades now. My honours thesis, which was my first taste of research life, analysed the proliferation of new genres of musical categorisation, which were being documented by the electronic dance music media of the early 90s. I argued then that new forms of youth citizenship were being constituted through a shared celebration of genre instability and a belief that these new forms of music were outside of what was knowable in language. Today, I find myself more interested in the new forms of language and meaning being produced to describe different aspects of our lived experience, particularly gender and sexuality, but also our cultural and generational locations. Since that time, I've also developed a deep passion for the productive possibilities of working at the intersection of different fields of practice. And to explain why I think this is so important, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the research centre that I've been involved with for the last 2 decades. The Centre for Social Research in Health was first formed as the National Centre in HIV Social Research over 30 years ago, one of 4 national centres funded as part of the Australian government response to HIV. Established by Professor Susan Kippax, this centre was grounded in a principle foregrounded in O'Sullivan's quote earlier, a deep appreciation for difference and a respect grounded in an unshakable belief that communities are the experts in their own lives. Researchers in our centre were tasked with engaging communities with humility, respect, and building trust over time with those who have very good reasons to be suspicious of anybody who seeks to interrogate and interpret their experiences for external purposes. So I had the opportunity to learn from those who've been working at the front lines of the HIV response from the beginning and who modelled effective approaches to creating these forms of partnership across incredibly different ways of looking at the world and at this virus. I'm not just talking about social researchers setting up co-design approaches with representatives of communities either, although that's an important feature of my centre also. I mean working in large teams and advisory structures that bring together people who are fiercely committed to completely different ways of addressing a shared concern, in that case, an ongoing global viral catastrophe. So this meant that we had sociologists like Raewyn Connell, for example, who were interested in lived experiences and social inequalities and structural change, who had to negotiate, contest, and hash out agreed ways of working, with epidemiologists interested in infection patterns across populations, clinicians interested in the safety and quality of care, policymakers interested in measurable outcomes of investments, and advocates fighting desperately on behalf of communities whose ways of life were often demonised, criminalised, or just entirely hidden from view. Seeing these partnerships in action, I came to understand that not only was it essential for all of these players and more to be working together to achieve more effective outcomes,
yeah, but only because Sally sent them.
but also that committing to this way of doing research opens you up to the challenge and change that comes from engaging with entirely different perspectives to your own. So I strive to continue to work in that way today. All my research is conducted collaboratively, grounded in principles of respect for and partnership with affected communities. So particularly in my case, people with HIV or with Hep B or Hep C, people of diverse genders or sexualities, with sex workers, with people who use drugs, with First Nations people, and many more, as well as a commitment to sitting with my own discomfort and the disruptive, difficult work of being challenged for what I assume I might know based on my own lived experience. And in this work, I am surrounded by sociologists, I have to say. And while maintaining a connection to sociology as a discipline can be challenging in this context, it can take more work to code yourself into the predetermined systems of research classification. In line with, next slide here. No, oh yes, there's the QR code down the bottom. Collier and Williams-Vasey's wonderful work, Scoping the Boundaries of Sociology. I think this way of working can provide an important answer to their question of how and in what ways is sociology currently valued. In the context in which I work, at least, sociologists are valued for bringing an attention to social practices and structures, to the analysis of health issues which affect the entire population, as we're now seeing with COVID also, as well as a commitment to and methodologies for achieving impacts through collaboration. So rather than looking at the boundary work involved in constituting sociology as a discipline in this concept, I want to look at how the concept of intersections can help us with thinking through the generative possibilities for sociological practice beyond the boundaries of areas or themes of interest in our research. I'm thinking here in particular of advice I often give early career researchers and research students to not feel they need to limit themselves to a particular topic or method or theory or discipline or field even, because while there is immense value in focusing and building a body of work in one area, for me, the joy in the learning has always come from pushing up against the edges of the familiar and being open, ready to being transformed by what is made possible by working at those intersections. So my next radical proposition for you all is that to save the world, you all need to join more than one TASA thematic group, which is a terrible joke. And yet I remain convinced that when we deliberately put ourselves into contexts that require us to work at the intersection of different areas of interest, we make possible a more inclusive way of thinking and doing research. I've been a member of a number of different thematic groups over the years, but the three I've been most engaged with are health, genders and sexualities, and family and relationships. And if you asked me to pick what was most important, I couldn't, because they each matter to me. But when I think about their relationships or their intersections, this also changes what I can know and do in each of these areas. And I'm deliberately using the term intersections here with a connection to intersectionality research, which is intentionally loose, because research divisions are not social divisions. So the theory is not designed for application here. But there are two aspects of intersectionality theory that I think may be appropriate to bring into this conversation. The first is that intersectionality helps us to think across categories. The second is the enduringly significant insight for me that the categories we use to explain and understand difference are mutually constitutive of each other. So both of those are quotes from Neer and Yuval Davis, and I've got one reference up there with the QR code. But I've also included a brief quote here from a paper by Cho, Crenshaw and McCall on intersectionality studies, where they say, this framing, this conceiving of categories not as distinct, but as always permeated by other categories, fluid and changing, always in the process of creating and being created by dynamics of power, emphasizes what intersectionality does, rather than what intersectionality is. And so yes, research divisions are not social divisions, but they do force the organisation of our practices into categories of sameness and difference. And they reinforce particular alliances and affiliations within and across these categories, which can also reproduce particular power dynamics between fields and disciplines. And this may not be a problem all the time. We do need categories to become decipherable to others, to locate ourselves and to distinguish ourselves for what we are not. But intersectionality theory has convinced me that having a commitment to recognising different forms of social experience and identity does not represent a threat to the meaning of the original categories. One does not replace or subtract from the other, they are mutually constitutive. In a related fashion, I believe that working at the intersection of different research areas can really help us challenge and expand our understanding of the primary categories of meaning that we work with and within. So I want to look very briefly at how working at the intersection of my three areas of interest has created opportunities for me to recognise how they are mutually constitutive. I'm just going to go through three examples. The first is an example from working at the intersection of health and families and relationships. So of course I've got a tree here because we're talking the family. Not very clever with my metaphors. The family has been a focus of sociology for decades, but in the field of health research I've mainly worked in, which is HIV and sexual health, there was very little attention to the particular role that families might play in the response to bloodborne viruses. A few years ago, I proposed a new collaboration between my centre and colleagues at the Social Policy Research Centre who have particular expertise in family relationships and care dynamics, and a new partnership with community and clinical organisations with a particular interest in the family life of transmissible infections that included the Paediatric HIV unit at the Sydney Kids Hospital, Carers New South Wales, Positive Life New South Wales and others. We were awarded a Discovery Project grant, which was amazing, and now we're in the final stages of publishing. And what was consistently interesting to me in leading this project that I wanted to just mention today is that while we had plenty of insights to share about how families feel about these health issues, their stories about the intimate encounters that they had with the stigmatized and still frightening infections we were looking at revealed more about what families mean, how they are practiced, and how they come to figure in and shape the way that communities respond to adversity more generally than they did even those specific health topics. So when we looked at what risk meant, what mattered to participants was actually not so much the perceived threat to the health of their family. They wanted to keep the family safe from the potential social risks and impacts of association with a stigmatized condition. And we looked at the issue of disclosure within families. While there were some who were shocked by the perceived threat to the life of a loved one, participants mostly spoke at length about the family imaginaries that were revealed through their experiences of preparing to talk about that threat and their desire to protect those imaginaries in any way they could from the potential effects of those difficult conversations. So while our initial focus was a specific health issue, and sociology has much to provide in expanding those understandings, the more important outcomes, arguably, from working at that intersection were the insights we gained about how much effort is invested in protecting the idea or the ideal of the family from the threat of social stigma and internal distress. Moving on to my next example, which is at the intersection of families and genders and sexualities, I'll speak to a paper I led from the Queer Generation Study, which was another discovery project led by Peter Aggleton, in which we interviewed LGBTQ+ Australians born in the 70s and the 90s. Now, research on queer and trans young people has been dominated by a focus on experiences of exclusion, rejection, and marginalisation. And that's for good reason, because these have been dominant experiences and continue to be in many parts of the world, including in Australia. But in reading through our interview data, I was really struck by a number of stories from participants who had experiences growing up in families that were very supportive and caring. So although this project was very much focused on genders and sexualities, because of my other interests in families, these data really stood out to me as deserving of focused analysis. And what I found in that process was fascinating. Participants born in the 70s were often apologetic about having had supportive families, believing this represented a counter-narrative to the dominant experience and a missed opportunity to share in the rite of passage of family rejection. So looking at what family meant helped us to see something quite different about what it might mean to belong to an imagined queer community and cohort. Those born in the 90s, in contrast, saw belonging to family as a birthright and entitlement. But even this set of increased expectations, which are appropriate, produced new ways of understanding how family life and queer life can be mutually constitutive, with quite particular scripts for the performance of family acceptance now becoming written into the forms of queer subjectivity and citizenship which were articulated by these younger participants. So my final set of examples takes us back to thinking about health, which in my case, I always do because I just am endlessly fascinated by anything to do with health. But in this case, I wanted to look at a couple of papers I've been involved with that also focus on genders and sexualities, and which have, through this approach, through this intersection, captured what I think are some very important proposals being generated in community contexts, which challenge us all to think quite differently about what we mean by health and how we approach the design and delivery of healthcare systems. The first is another paper from the Queer Generation study focused on what inclusive healthcare meant to these two generations. We found that those born in the 70s talked very much about how difficult it had been to find healthcare that felt safe, and that they'd relied on the directories of gay-friendly services that you found in many queer community publications at that time to support the intensive work of locating clinicians who could be trusted to provide good care, or at the very least to be not explicitly discriminatory. Those born in the 90s had a different set of expectations. Not only was it easier to find clinicians who knew what they were doing, including through social media, they were often much more sure about their right to access high quality healthcare from any clinician, but particularly finding those who knew how to understand their needs or how to educate themselves if they didn't. But both generations talked about how much they hated the awkwardness of making a clinician uncomfortable and the emotional work that was involved in reading the subtleties of clinicians' self-consciousness about getting something wrong. We proposed the idea of inclusivity labour to capture these forms of work in locating and co-creating inclusive healthcare experiences across generations. But rather than concluding from this that this is yet more evidence that there are the needs of an underserved minority which continue to be overlooked, we argued that this reveals why we need to be fundamentally rethinking our assumptions about the needs of every health service user. So rather than assuming that inclusion means extending our existing systems to better address the needs of a particular minority group, so the kind of genders and sexualities lens saying that's what we're finding about this group, we argued that the forms of diversities that our participants represented reveals a faulty logic at the heart of the presumption of what inclusion needs to involve. A faulty logic presuming that there is a majority mainstream into which any minority must be subsumed. Because in fact, diverse forms of experience, of course, exist in every setting, in every service, and should always be assumed to be sitting in front of every clinician in every clinical consultation. And this is what an inclusive approach makes possible. It's not an easy or polite process. It requires often a completely radical remaking of all of the ways in which we work. Once we're challenged to appreciate that the existing categories that we are using to recognize human experience simply do not apply to all. One final paper I want to talk about comes from a small pilot project led by Ali Gibson, who's now in New Zealand, which we called the Trans-Inclusive Cervical Cancer Project. So this study was inspired by some innovative community responses to the relaunch of the National Cervical Cancer Screening Program, which has happened over the last few years, when the long-established approach of 2 yearly pap smears to check for cancer cells was replaced with a 5-yearly screen for the presence of HPV, which is the virus which causes almost all cervical cancers. With the government investing large amounts in campaigns to educate the community and clinical services about this very significant shift in practice, they also targeted specific amount of resources to engaging particular groups who were recognised as less regularly screening for cervical cancer. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, women who did not speak English as a first language, and the LGBTQ community. And I haven't used the term women in that final group on purpose because the LGBTQ community response was to develop peer-based services and health promotion campaigns, which expanded the messaging to include all people with a cervix, not just women. Because lots of trans men, for example, have a cervix, as do many non-binary people like myself. So we were able to capture some of the fascinating work underway at the time by interviewing key informants who are working in cancer prevention, in sexual and reproductive health, and in trans health advocacy. And we found that these insights took us beyond simply adding a gender lens to what we already know about a health subject by showing us the fundamental problems that can be created when we locate a binary gendered subject at the centre of healthcare systems. So as we argued in that paper, drawing on Sarah Ahmed, meaningful inclusion requires broad recognition of the ways that institutionalized spaces are oriented towards certain bodies. And without that, those who do not neatly fit will continue to come up against what Ahmed calls the brick walls of institutionalized healthcare systems. One of the structures that maintains those walls is cisgenderism, the cultural and systemic ideology that perpetuates the belief that cisgender identities and expressions are both more ordinary and more valuable than transgender identities and expressions, and maintaining the presumption that bodies always align with gender and that the way we look can reveal the healthcare that we need. In addition to attending to the radical work of decolonising institutions, which is absolutely critical and must be centralised, these insights remind us that we have to also be working to dismantle other systems of oppression that can keep particular groups locked into or out of the containers that structure the way we organise our social institutions, particularly those that presume all people can be meaningfully engaged with systems that fix gender into binary stable categories across time, place, and populations. Because this is incorrect, inadequate, and every institution really must be preparing to face this fact. I'm almost out of time, which I recognise, but I just want to spend my final few minutes speaking about another intersection that I feel passionately about, and that is to be creatively and purposefully working at the intersection of the personal and the professional. Now, this is clearly not a new idea, but I do want to end nonetheless with a call for more of us in sociology to be investing in the hard and vulnerable work of owning the forms of experience that inform our own standpoints and bringing that into the public stories that we generate to communicate our contributions as sociologists. Because I do believe that this is where some of our most powerful contributions can be made. This is not a plea for everyone to start publishing their reflexive writing, but it is a chance to advocate for an approach to sociology that is grounded in an appreciation of lived experience, both our own unique perspectives, as well as the deliberate ongoing work of respecting and amplifying the lived experience of others. So here is my, there you go, there is my hard and vulnerable work. Haven't ever put a photo of my own face in a PowerPoint presentation quite that big before, so here we go. Bringing aspects of my own personal world into my research work has been liberating for me. So perhaps I'm a little evangelical on this topic, but I do feel that many researchers probably unnecessarily avoid that experience of bringing their intimate selves into the work for fear that it may be too uncomfortable, embarrassing, or indeed self-indulgent. And it absolutely may be all of those things at some point. I certainly grappled with these feelings when I was a guest recently on SBS Insight, asked to talk about both my personal but also my professional perspectives on the topic of multigender attraction or bisexuality. But we can reframe this self-consciousness, I think, as a positive attribute to support what O'Sullivan and other First Nations scholars and activists have been teaching us for many years about positionality, standpoints, and Yindyamara, bringing our own histories and assumptions and unique contributions to practices of respectful dialogue and learning across difference. So being open to this process has led to opportunities for me to become involved in research with my own community of people of diverse sexualities, including as a parent of the two amazing kids that you've seen in my slides today who are growing up in a queer family arrangement that I'm very proud of. And I'm also written about the points of tension and convergence between my own values as a queer non-binary person and those of my Christian family, with their permission. And as we face another period of attention to religious discrimination, for example, at the moment, I'm rethinking about the value of some of those stories. And now I find myself moving into a range of new research areas, which are also connected to my personal experiences, including the engagement of neurodiverse adolescents with HPV vaccination programs, the negotiation of ethically non-monogamous relationships during COVID-19, which is very complex for many people, and strategies for supporting queer and trans communities as they age. And I see some collaborators in this group today in some of the work in that space, which is really exciting. The strategy that's worked for me in finding ways to sustainably and meaningfully work at each of these intersections over time is to find my people in the research communities to which I'm connected, and to build what feels to me like really meaningful collaborations that can help us all make our way through the many barriers that we face. And among these, I have to say, it's the collaborations I've built with HDRs and ECRs, which are among the most profound I have ever experienced. The wisdom of my doctoral candidates and others I work with, such as Anthony Smith, who's here, I think, TASA postgraduate lead, Sudith Kumar and Giselle Newton, never failed to blow my mind and to remind me why I got into this research caper in the first place, but also why I don't seem to be able to leave. I like to believe most sociologists love to be challenged and to think critically and carefully about pretty much everything. But it is genuinely hard to pull yourself out of your comfort zones over time and put yourself in the way of what feels new and confronting. It's also very difficult to live in conditions of ongoing uncertainty, which we are all more aware of than ever. But there is a humility that comes with remaining open and curious about difference and resisting the desire to locate yourself in fields, themes, or ways of working that keep us feeling comfortable and safe. So here's to continuing to think across the categories that contain us and to creating the conditions to support others to join us on that wonderful journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christy. That was amazing. And I've made a lot of notes, and we're going to be going back and scanning all those QR codes that an academic dreamboat would provide, because of course they would. If people have questions, feel free to raise your hand and I will try to juggle the screens to find who you are. Or there's a question in the chat from Peter. Thank you for such a great presentation. First, what advice or suggestions do you have for junior researchers who are starting out and might be working at the intersections? How do they negotiate this as part of their professional identity construction?
That's a really good question. It's something I think about all the time. I mean, I think maybe it might be useful to normalize that this is really hard, that this is really confronting, and that this doesn't end as a practice of rethinking how you know, what it's identity work, like what is the story that works for you and how might you need to adapt that. I think that it's really important to also give yourself permission to have multiple stories depending on who your audience is, and that will happen over time, that you'll need to write differently and code yourself differently depending on what you're trying to achieve. It's fine to be strategic. That is part of this work. I do have clearly a personal passion for working at the edges of things and the conversations and the creativity that's possible when you're working together with people who have different perspectives. So I'm going to be biased in my advice around that. But I think TASA is a really interesting example for me, because TASA has provided a space that has felt to me like a place that I can fit without being constrained. I can find a way to have access to people who speak the kind of language that I speak and are interested in the same kinds of questions and issues, but they don't need me to be a very particular way in order to perform that. You know, it's big enough and there's enough space for me to locate myself and to keep on locating myself differently over time. So what advice would I give? I think practicing through language the different ways of describing who you are and what you're interested in, and just giving yourself permission for that to be an ongoing process, and getting feedback. some of the ways that might work for you to make sense in your mind might not translate to others. I think that's really, really important to get advice on. And I do think everybody, I've had great advice from mentors at key points around not feeling like I had to find a specialism to really kind of define myself in, that it was okay that my desire was to be broader, because we need different kinds of researchers. We need people who really do go deep on very specific areas, and we need the ones who connect horizontally more. So I know I'm that latter group, but it's taken a long time to build confidence around that. So I think, yes, normalizing that it's confronting, it takes time, you'll have multiple versions, and that's ongoing, but finding the kind of keywords and the narrative descriptions, but also the classifications that you feel communicates to the people you want to connect to. It's trial and error. Get lots of feedback.
I'm going to jump back in because, Carla, I'll let you go first because I will be hogging everything later on as the chair, and I want to do. Over to you, Carla.
Oh, thank you. Also happy for you to hog everything, Kate. Hi, Christy. Thank you so much. That was so great. And it's so great to see everybody, even if it's on Zoom. I loved your talk, and I absolutely agree about your call to positionality, and I'm also thinking a lot lately about how our institutions also really want us to blend our personal lives, and they kind of exploit our passion for the work that we want to do with communities as well. So how do you navigate the institution while maintaining that commitment to positionality and to working with communities? How does that play out for you?
That's a very good question. I was actually reflecting on the kind of I was reading about boundaries in two contexts. One, I was reading about kind of sociology, boundary work in sociology, and the other was all of the work that's happening at the moment around boundaries in our emotional and relationship lives. Like, how do you enact the strategies that will keep you well in order to be able to make a difference in the world and have look after yourself, look after others, and so on. I think boundaries are key there. So higher education institutions, in my experience, will never provide the conditions that show you what is enough, and provide for you the framework to keep you safe and well, and doing work, including while you're working at your edges. They rely upon our enthusiasm. That's the way the model and the culture works. That's really problematic, and I'm absolutely not suggesting that that's not something that we should continue to push back in and articulate the problematic impacts of all the time. But a bit like the narrative or identity work around how you describe who you are, I think that there's a responsibility that we have in finding a way to live, to be located in this space and to contribute that doesn't compromise, that is enlivened by what you care about without exploiting it. And I think that is going to be different for every single person, how that works. I just spoke yesterday, actually, I asked our Pro-Vice Chancellor of Diversity and Inclusion at my university a personal question about, how does she manage the boundaries around something that she cares so deeply about? And she had some interesting strategies that were mostly about meditation and, centering herself before she goes into meetings where, she knows she's going to come up against people who disagree. And I think that some of that, sure, is the kind of self-care stuff. But I just think, I worry that there's an incredible power that can come from finding the points at which your what matters to you as a human aligns with what you're trying to do in your research work. And so kind of identify, doesn't mean working at that place all the time, but identifying where it's going to be useful and very strategically using those opportunities. I think that's what I would hope that we see more of. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I do think about this a lot also.
I think completely, it's like we don't want to be exploited by the institution, but we don't want to be constrained by not being exploited by them, so that we don't follow our passions and don't do what's important to us. So yeah, I think, thank you. It's really helpful. Thanks.
Look who's back again. I was hoping you could talk more about the work you've done with institutions when trying to achieve institutional change, what you talked about, the faulty logic of, say, the healthcare system, and how you then take your research findings through those institutions and try to advocate for change.
So I have two jobs, which I would say is probably one too many, but one of my jobs is Associate Dean of Engagement and Impact for what is a new faculty in our university post workplace change, arts design and architecture. And I think a lot about the very different ways in which we understand what making a difference with our research means across the different disciplines that are in this faculty. And I guess, what is obvious, but also consistently kind of impressive, is how many different ways there are to work in the world or outside of the academy. But also how much it relies on relationships. It's intimate. It's structural, but it's intimate. It's about who you know and how you work with the people that you know. Now I'm going to sound like a networking consultant, which I really don't want to. But so I think that I'm not sure that I want to kind of provide any examples of great kind of policy or practice change from my own work. I certainly can say that the people that I've worked with and alongside are responsible for remarkable things over time, including the fact that in Australia, we really have been protected from the worst of the HIV epidemic, and that's because governments were convinced to agree that communities were the experts in their own lives. I know our centre and the work that they did influenced that, provided the evidence to demonstrate that that was a policy position the government could have. So that is and that continues. We fund peer-based community organisations in Australia in order to work with their communities because they're the experts. They know how to do it. They know how to make sure people have access to the information that they need, yes, without being patronised or misunderstood by governments who are trying to work across the whole. So that's a kind of bigger picture, and really I think there was a few things that were part of that, and they probably apply to the work that I still do now. Part of it is about building long-term trusted relationships with key people in key organisations. So that means it's not one sector. You have to have relationships with people in government. At each level of government, you have to have relationships with people in clinical organisations. They have to be respected as people whose voices will be heard in other contexts. You have to work with and gain the trust of community advocacy groups, and that's not something you do once. It is a long-term, ongoing strategic investment. And if people believe you are doing that for your own gain, that relationships won't work, just like most relationships won't work when that doesn't feel like there's reciprocity and genuine trust and respect as part of those relationships. So yes, I would say that in every project that I'm involved with, I'm talking to people in the organisations who I hope will either support and make the research possible, but also be responsible for making change from the outcomes from the very beginning, before even the ideas are kind of created, and then they're part of the conversation the whole way through. And I think there's some key things there. It's actually also, it means things like, this is difficult for a lot of sociologists depending on the context in which you work, co-authoring publications with people who are not sociologists and have very different ways of working, and finding those opportunities to bring them together. That's been a key strategy for me, and certainly in terms of building trust, because it recognises expertise is held in different forms and that we have to be doing these things collaboratively. Did I answer your question?
Yes. And now I've got another one.
No. Okay.
So I think you're my kindred academic spirit, but more articulate and gooder. I'll make that. I work in a very similar way, and I think academia is a social business. Everything is social. Your CV is an indelible record of, do you play nicely with others, for example? Who do you work with? The God Professor model's gone. And developing these partnerships with research end users and doing that authentic research that they want to get involved with and want to take up and use is key. That's a long-term project, that establishing and maintaining these relationships over a really long term. I was wondering what advice you have for people starting out as to how they can go about making connections, doing things when resources are shrinking, workloads are getting heavier. How do people navigate in that space?
Look, I just want to also affirm that it is incredibly challenging, and for challenging for everybody. And institutions don't provide, in workload models or through funding, kind of internal support and so on, support for that work, for the relationship work, even though we know across the board it is critical to achieving the things that they want around Category 1 funding and industry partnerships and et cetera, et cetera. So that it is a problem, and it's a challenge. I think you can do remarkable things with even a small number of strong relationships. It's not about trying to kind of, I don't know, establish yourself as the only person working in a space, or being the first person doing something, or knowing everybody. It's about sounding out, reaching out, learning from, and continuing to kind of make connections until you find the ones that are actually going to kind of I don't want to say bear fruit, because it's not always about the kind of end point. It's actually about what you both gain from the connection, and that can be all kinds of things. I think it's really key there, though. And again, I'm going to, I'm doing a leadership course at the moment, so I'm reading some of this stuff about networking at the moment. I don't want to sound like a management journal, but it's really important that you're not trying to establish relationships out with kind of external organizations or communities and so on, with only your, I guess, the end point in mind, like what you need. And that's really difficult when you don't have much time, and there feels like there's a lot at stake. What you need to be interested in is, what do people need? What matters to them? What are their priorities? And how are they thinking about things? And how do they work? And where might you be able to help with that? When would it be useful? When is it useful for you to come in and do a seminar in their organisation to talk about this new issue that they don't know anything about? When are you able to get access to some of the full text articles that they're behind journal paywalls and they can't get? When are you how can you make sure they know that when something comes up, they can ask you a question, and that means that you'll be the next person. I think it's also really important to not always feel like you need to be building the relationships with people at the top. or people who are senior, because often the strongest longer term relationships they feel more peer based. So, and that includes within research cultures, right? Like, don't always just look for mentors who are senior, go for, build really strong connections with your peers, because you are research culture. This is the group that you will move with and be and over time, and you can reciprocally support each other over time. So yes, did that answer your question?
Sure.
I'm raving a bit at this point.
That's fine. I have another question from Christina Ho, who thanks you for your presentation and was taken by your concept of inclusivity labour, and was hoping you could say a little more about it and what kinds of institutional settings have you used it to understand the micropolitics of interpersonal interaction.
Good question. We've only used it in that one paper. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I'd really like to continue to think about how it might be useful in other settings, because I do think we're seeing this across as a kind of organizational anxiety maybe, and kind of set of new priorities is the work around how do we make cultures more inclusive in very, very different settings. So I've put the link in the notes, so you can see the early work that I've done around that in that paper. Which one is it? It's in anyway, it's there. Where is it? Somewhere. No. Anyway, I'll find it and post it again. So yeah, so I would say there's lots of, I'd be really interested in talking to this person. Thank you for the question, because I think we looked very much, again, it was a gender and sexualities lens. We were looking really at very specifically how do these kind of ideas about making healthcare inclusive play out? What are the strategies and practices that people are bringing to that? But I think it applies, to many other forms of difference and diversity.
Absolutely. That was Christina Ho, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Can chase them up. And I have another question
Great.
from Anne Lawless, who's asking, how can health consumer reps and health activists meet and link with university workers? How do community even meet a university researcher? Oh, email us. We'd love you to.
Email. Yeah. I think it's interesting on Twitter. Every time I say, please ask for a copy of a paper, please just contact us, people always need to hear it. So I would hope more academics would be making that really clear, that we want to hear, and please send emails. I guess the bigger question is, how do you come to know who to talk to? And I think this is a problem in every institution. Again, working now as an associate dean, I'm just like, websites and research bio kind of systems, they're just impossible, and they don't do anything to actually reveal who people are and how to find them and how they're interconnected and how that changes. It's really frustrating. So I would say yes, it's Google searching and trying your best, and then reaching out, and you'll find the people who are keen pretty quickly, because you won't hear back from people who aren't.
Excellent advice. And they should also be forwarding you on to other people if they're not the right person, if they're a good egg.
If they're a good egg, but this is the thing, right? Like you don't know about this until you try, but that just doesn't mean that you stop trying. And then as soon as you find the people who are the connectors and the ones who get excited and want to help you, yeah.
And another question, it's all taking off now. Another question from Josephine Brown. Thanks to you again. And appreciates the encouragement to be diverse in our approaches. Having had a former life in social welfare, I find I can't choose between the TASA interest groups. I was given a lot of advice during my PhD that said I should choose, and agree that TASA is wonderfully inclusive even for ECRs. And I've read that question out. I'm not even a sociologist. I'm pretending to be one. So do whatever you want. I'll let you feel, and if there wasn't really a question, even though I read it out, but if you'd like to talk a bit more about the advantages of not being that reductive very tightly focused academic.
Yeah. Look, I think I mean, I just have to claim what I am, which is I'm a promoter of working across areas. I just, that is always going to be my message. And it is partly because it's worked for me. And I know that is a N=1 problem in terms of giving any kind of mentoring advice. But it does protect you in terms of meaning that you have access to more possible streams of work or collaborations and adaptability over time. But also I just like it in terms of the liveliness of ideas and perspectives. It just kind of, it opens you up. But it does mean you don't have one small area to define yourself in and be recognized for. And there's a cost to that. And I totally own it. It very much depends on the individual. Some people need to feel and really benefit from and do very well in honing in on one specialist area. It's not the way I work. I could try, but I don't think I'd do a good job of it. So I think it's really about working out for yourself. But I don't think you can divide the entire world into generalists and specialists, but sometimes I kind of think it's a little bit like that. Like you kind of have tendencies, like what really is the space that helps you work best? Is it when you're focusing down and you're really defining that, or is it when you're feeling like you have an openness and a flexibility?
Trying to scroll through all of the messages of thanks, and the institutional labour is really resonating with people. So maybe a book on that in your spare time would be nice. That would be good for me personally. I'm trying to find if there's any other nubs. Peter has posted that there'll be more about working outside of academia in tomorrow's plenary as well. I was hoping, something I wrote down as you were going through your slides, you could give us the backstory on the photo of the one that you put up about the research centre that you're at, the military groups, and where the context
where did I
of
take that?
Yeah.
That was Mardi Gras. So it was this next Mardi Gras, I think it'll be 3 years ago. It was a very significant Mardi Gras for me because I was part of the bi-visibility float, and it's the first time I'd done something kind of very kind of public and open around bisexuality, which is a complicated part of the LGBTQ kind of umbrella assemblage, as Anthony Smith will put it. And I just snapped it. So I was sitting waiting with my group, and the marching of the military and the police in the parade is really, really divisive as an issue. Very, very strong feelings on both sides. And that's because of the criminalisation and the violence that these communities have experienced over decades, of course, and concerns that that's not being recognised if these the armed forces and the police and so on march in the parade. So that was a person that I knew who was in JAG for that particular event, who was part of our float. And it was funny actually because they had high heels on, which meant they couldn't walk on the grass. So they were just like waiting, just sitting over there and just waiting. And then it just happened that the others gathered behind them, and I went, oh, that's a good photo.
Fantastic. We have 2 more minutes. If anyone wants to pop up with another final question, otherwise I will turn it over to Christy to give her, last minute words of advice, particularly for ECRs or people really struggling with how to manage the challenges of academia at the moment and do the types of work that with community and the things that may not be as easily recognised in the academic system, and where you find that motivation to keep going and not burn yourself out.
I think it's really important to give yourself permission to start small and to not feel like you have to be kind of doing all of that at once. Like these are long-term kind of principles, but if you have a majority of work over here and very little time, what's something small that you can do working collaboratively with one person or one, write write one paper together, for example, or do a small kind of a collaborative activity. Look for any pots of money that you might be able to get access to that are about forming new teams, that they often are focused on impact-oriented research these days. And so I think there's going to be more and more of those things that institutions are coming up with. So yeah, but also if you're getting advice not to do that, doesn't mean the advice is wrong, just that it's really good to get advice from a few people, I think. And because, you know, we all have our things we are passionate about and that we believe work well, and it does frustrate me when I hear people say, oh, I've been advised I've got to do this, because it's just rarely the case that you've got to do one thing. There's so many different ways to navigate through and to create meaningful and effective and successful institutionally forms of research. And so I'd be actually reaching out to academics that you admire and seeing whether they'd be willing to have conversations with you about how they've done it and what they think you might be able to do.
Just typing in the comments.
Absolutely reject competitive academia. Don't believe it. When people tell you that it has to be about competition, don't believe it. It's collaboration. It's the other word. You can always replace competition with collaboration, always.
Yeah, you don't have to be the first one to get that paper out. It doesn't have to be the best thing. The more the merrier. The more people in your little area means it's a thing.
And
it's
as you
vibrant.
said, it's strength. That's where the strength lies, actually. That's where the power is. So own it. Yeah.
And follow the fun as well. Well, now we've gone a minute over time. So thank you to everyone for coming. This has been a really encouraging conversation. And to be honest, I kind of needed it today. It's been fabulous. And thank you so much, Christy, for this really engaging and offbeat, not the traditional talk, which has been perfect.
Very pleased to be here, and thanks everybody, and thanks to the people who are here who I recognise on the gallery as well, including people who gave me advice on this talk. So really appreciate it. And what a dream note to finish. I think that's the term of the day, and you can thank Lucy Nicholas for that one to push her under the bus on the way out. She's terrible. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Christy.